CharityVillage Connects. Today we're exploring the critical need for charities and nonprofits to embrace technology and digitize operations in order to build resilience and thrive in the future. Joining me today is Aine McGlynn. Aine runs a consulting company dedicated to upping the digital skills and information practices of small nonprofit organizations. And full disclosure, she's also the author of the Charity Village e-learning course, Digital Transformation for Nonprofits. Welcome, Anya.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm delighted to be here.
I wonder if you could start by introducing us to the work that you do with nonprofits looking to undertake this important digital transformation.
Yeah, happy to, Mary. The work that I do is mostly focused on small nonprofits. So, the organizations that are sort of $1 million and less, which we all know constitute the vast majority of charities in the Canadian nonprofit sector. And I work with them mostly on establishing their priorities for their digital transformation and also sort of road mapping a right-sized sequence for them to tackle what is really quite a big challenge. I meet organizations at various stages of readiness in terms of digital transformation. So I like to meet them where they are. For some, that means we're moving into the cloud for the very first time. What do we need to know? What do we need to think about in order to carry out that process effectively and efficiently and get people using these new tools? For others, they're further down the road. They've started using cloud computing technologies, but have found that approach has been a little bit ad hoc, and they find themselves with data that's kind of disconnected, people who are using some things in some ways, some people who are not using anything at all, other people who are using shadow systems. And so in that case, that's always an act of kind of consolidation and focusing in on which technologies to use for what purposes. So, but in every case, it really is an act of wayfinding, sequencing, and prioritizing with respect to how to undertake that kind of transformation.
So let's take a step back and look at the big pictures. And can you describe in your words, from your experience, why digitization is so important for nonprofits? In other words, for nonprofits who have yet to get started or who are early on in that journey, why should they invest in this kind of work?
It's funny. I was making this case and this argument 10 years ago when I was running a program to address the digital skills gap in the nonprofit sector. And then at that time, we had a hard time even socializing the concept of cloud computing. And this was with big private sector funders who were like, don't really know what you're talking about. Feels like this is a nice to have. Of course, 10 years later, and on the back of a global pandemic, we all can see that this is not a nice to have, that being able to collaborate across space and time to work from anywhere becomes the really key solid driver for organizations who haven't yet made the jump into using digital technology. So obviously remote work is a key driver. But beyond that, I would say, it's about greater efficiency, about doing a little bit more with less when you're thinking about how to smooth out some of those time-consuming manual processes related to technology and data and leverage technology to make them a bit quicker and more efficient. And then finally, I would say it's about expectations of a 21st century stakeholder. Internet technology is not new anymore. It's not novel. The idea of being able to use any internet-enabled device to be able to do any number of things on the internet is not new. It's commonplace. It's now part of our habits. So when someone who's perhaps a new donor or a volunteer encounters your digital infrastructure and has a less than ideal experience with it, it can sort of create a barrier or a sense of mistrust or misunderstanding with respect to that organization. Similarly, with service users, again, we have an expectation that technology will kind of surprise and delight us. There's all sorts of great examples from the private sector about how we use technology in really delightful ways that make us really happy to engage with whatever product or service that we're engaging with. And those expectations don't change when the person encounters a nonprofit's digital service, whether that's learning or access to resources. They do tend to come with those same sets of expectations, and when you can't meet them, again, it creates that kind of friction, mistrust, and we think that technology used effectively can help smooth out some of those bumps. Yeah.
So, what are the biggest barriers that are preventing nonprofit organizations from making progress in this area? I mean, certainly there's the obvious budget issue, but I think you're touching on earlier, even the mindset has to change. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, more than anything else, I would argue that it's never been more affordable to use digital technologies effectively. I think an organization with a budget of maybe $7,000 to $10,000 annually invested in the actual subscription cost for the technology can get really, really far. But the true cost has to take into account the level of skill and the wherewithal to be able to use those technologies effectively. And that true cost is often kind of left out of the picture. So when we're talking about it from a budget consideration, it's not the hard costs of the tools themselves. Like that's not prohibitive. There's also a lot of, like Google for nonprofits, for example, you get up to like 2,000 user licenses, right? And that is an incredibly powerful suite of tools. But most organizations that I encounter are using like maybe 10% of what that tool is capable of. So in fact, I think that the barrier is it's the hard technical skills, which is not unique to the nonprofit sector, by the way. This is we have a little bit of a skills deficit with respect to technology usage across this country. So, but the sector becomes uniquely sort of vulnerable to that because perhaps we don't have the resources to outsource some of that work, or to call in support from folks like myself who become a little bit of an outsourced IT department or technology strategist. And then, of course, the other big barrier is the time and the focus on training and new habit building around technologies. I often say to my clients, like with any new skill you're learning, it requires a daily practice of habit. It requires that sort of discipline to reinforce that new skill or that new habit, and bringing technologies in to replace old workflows is exactly the same as learning a new habit. It requires that discipline, right? And so if we have organizations where folks are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week already, and for not enough money, and then having to sort of carve out time to do that whole change in terms of how they work, is a lot to ask. So that becomes a really big barrier that has to be managed with a lot of empathy, with a lot of grace, and with a lot, like with as many resources to support those individuals through their upskilling and their process transformation journey.
Yeah, it sounds like a big challenge for some of those organizations that might find themselves in those circumstances of wanting to do it, but then not being able to figure out how to make that happen. Um, but I think from your perspective, you see this as a necessary and not just a positive move for organizations. What are the biggest benefits to organizations who make a commitment to digital transformation?
I mean, I think it becomes very clear when organizations have really gotten it and have taken it on. They find themselves spending less time doing burdensome administrative work, and more time doing mission related work. And when an organization is technologically enabled, they are able to deliver on the mission related work while at the same time having processes and systems in the background that capture the data related to that mission related work as a side effect or as a symptom of doing the mission related work, right? So it's never the case then that, oh, okay, a program, we've ran it for 12 months and it was great, and now we have to write a report. Okay, let's go back 12 months and how many workshops did we run? Do we have attendance data for that? We have a little bit over here. Do we know who our facilitators were? And it's that sort of that data capture and that information capture happens after the fact, as opposed to, if you contrast that with an organization that's really digitally enabled, they're collecting all of that information all along, and making it available to a reporting system or to a dashboard, so that when it comes to that critical reporting period, it's a matter of sharing a link with the funder, and it's like, this data is going to come in real time. Feel free to check in at 3 months, at 6 months, at 12 months, right? So it's not just even, so obviously that's an example of efficient reporting, but it's also an example of cultivating trust through transparency about your data, and that can happen when we get really smart about using technology to capture the pieces of our work related to impact and related to mission, right? So on the one hand, you're creating this sense of trust, and then on the other hand, you're freeing yourself up to be able to focus more on the mission than the menial work of tracking information and attendance. Yeah.
Well, I guess that sort of real-time data collection and reporting, excuse me, can also make organizations much more nimble about decision making and being able to respond more effectively to things that they might have to change in real time. Would you say that that's also a benefit?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Nimble, not only in terms of changes that might happen from the funder's perspective or from a stakeholder's perspective, but also in terms of being able to respond to emerging opportunities, right? The organization, again, that is capturing their impact program mission related data really well, just in real time, as a matter of all of their activities, will be able to put together that emergent grant application that somebody comes across, or be able to take that meeting with that funder that just pops up. Oh my gosh, they happen to be in town, they've invited us to lunch. I can speak super confidently about all my program data without having to be like, okay, I need to spend the next 48 hours, pulling data from a bunch of different places to try and have that conversation, right? So, that organization who's ready to respond to emergent questions about their work and is technologically enabled, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to create any additional work or stress because they're prepared for that. Also makes partnership easier, right? If you're hoping to partner with another organization, and you have a really clear sense of what you do and how you do it, and so do they, it makes that sort of fact finding or fit testing that much easier, because everybody knows what each other is working on and working with. So I think the benefits are really clear. We used to talk about sort of the importance of collaboration, efficiency, and transparency, right? So if we think of those as 3 points of a triangle, it's often very easy to be efficient and transparent, but difficult to do that with others in collaboration. You can be efficient and you can collaborate, but can you do so in a way that's transparent along the journey? Less so. You can be transparent and you can collaborate, but is it easy to do that efficiently, right? And a technologically enabled organization will be able to hit all 3 points of that triangle, which just speaks to greater impact and, like you said, greater agility.
Well, what do you recommend to small organizations who may feel that digital transformation is beyond their reach? How do you get them to the space where they can actually embrace it?
It's an interesting question. I take a really human sort of centered approach in my work with my clients. And so My first question would be a very human based question, would be like, well, what do you feel is holding you back personally, right? Ultimately, these organizations are made up with people who come into their work with all sorts of ideas about what they can and can't do. And technology learning and digital learning is not a neutral question. It's not a neutral position. It's loaded with all sorts of questions about equity, gender, access to learning, expectations about numeracy and data literacy. So oftentimes when organizations, because it's really people, when people feel that it's beyond them or they're not capable of it, there's often at the heart of that some resistance and some sense of perhaps shame or embarrassment that they haven't kept up to date, and that I think is one of the biggest things that I would ask folks to let go of, is this sense of, well, I can't do it and I don't know about those things, and I've never been good at technology. I use myself as an example. I have a PhD in literature. Like, I am not a technologist, but it was just through curiosity and mentorship that I was able to get a pretty deep subject matter expertise on this. But it didn't come naturally. It didn't come by training. And I think that so many organizations who resist or feel that it's not for them, they're actually coming to that place through a very personal sense of a resistance or a shame around technology. One of my favorite things to say on that point is that there's no curiosity and shame, right? If we feel embarrassed about what we haven't yet done with technology, any ability to be curious about it kind of goes out the window. So I always say to folks to start being a little bit of openness, and bring a bit of curiosity into their thinking about technology. Commit to learning maybe one new thing a week, practicing one new habit every week, and that's so that's the mindset answer to your question, Mary. But the more sort of, I guess, practical or tactical answer to that question is really do a skills audit. Sort of just have conversations with the folks in your organization about what kind of technology skills that they either think that they have or would like to build. You'd be surprised. Some people are sitting with colleagues who actually have a higher degree of skill than they're able to practice at the organization. So a good idea to do that kind of an audit. The other audit would be on the technologies that you're currently using, even if there's only a couple, to make that list and list how you're using them. And then the third thing would be process or workflow documentation, regardless of whether you're using technology or not. I mean, you could be the most paper-based analog organization in the world, and you have processes and workflows. And documenting those is an essential first step in seeing how they can be transformed or how they can be made more efficient. So those three things doesn't even have anything to do with technology. It's just an act of sort of benchmarking and setting the table for conversations about actual technology rather than the organizational context in which it'll be applied.
Yeah, it sort of sets the foundation for the path that they end up following in terms of this digital transformation. And certainly we know that a lot of organizations start the digitization process by choosing new software programs as a first step. Is that really the right approach? And what should organizations do first before they go there?
It's not the right approach, but it's a very common approach. Listen, we're solutions focused in this sector, right? I see a problem. What's the solution? I don't have time to be, dilly dallying on a whole lot of other questions about it. I just need to solve a problem, right? We work around culture and solutions focused culture in this sector is what makes us deliver, incredible, urgent work, but it also can get in the way of taking the time to be a bit more process minded with respect to choosing technology. Yeah, choosing the technology is the last thing on the list. The first thing is some of what I described, that people audit, that current technology audit, that process documentation or workflow documentation, and then the other thing I would add in there is a needs assessment. So if it occurs to you that you need a new CRM or constituent relationship management tool, the first thing to do is to speak to everybody in the organization who would be using it and ask what they would like out of a contact manager. Essentially, we'll call it that, or contact or data management tool. What do they need it to do? What expectations do they have of it? And once you have that needs documentation, then you can go and assess different tools against those established criteria. Oftentimes, organizations make these kinds of decisions based on word of mouth. Facebook groups, nonprofit Facebook groups. A board member might say, "Oh, I have a brother who works at such and such, and we can get a couple of discounted licenses." And all of those are important inputs, and that might help you kind of create a short list of tools, but they shouldn't be the main guiding principle behind your technology decision. And really, yeah, what you expect to do with that technology, how you think it'll fit into your organization, are far more important exercises than getting on that sales call with somebody who's going to sell you all the bells and whistles and convince you that these are things you need, when in fact you may not, right?
Well, yeah, how many times have we actually taken on new software or some sort of platform and then discovered that it really isn't serving our real purposes? And so I've certainly been there myself as in terms of running a business. But, in this process, often the human element is overlooked when organizations are taking steps towards digitization. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that's important to you in terms of how organizations can do it to ensure that they are creating a sort of human centered digitization of their organization.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that question. I think so. What I mentioned before about recognizing that people are coming to technology learning from all sorts of different past experiences. We know that in particular, women identified folks sometimes don't have the best experience of technology learning and data literacy learning. So again, sometimes there's a little bit of internalized resistance about what they can and cannot do with technology. So I think it's really important to allow people to speak openly about like what they're uncomfortable about or what they're afraid of with technology before jumping into, okay, here's the top 10 advanced Excel functions that you need to learn, right? That can come after. Those hard skills are, they can be taught in a myriad of different ways. There's so many different platforms to teach them and ways to learn them. But I think giving people the time and space to come to the training on their own terms is really important. I think trying to make it as fun as possible. So whether that's creating, a show and tell every Friday afternoons once a month, where each person kind of shows what they learned that week about technology, demos it for other folks, answers questions, right? I think a lot of us learn by teaching. So giving people the opportunity to be in that role is really helpful. I think, seeing, making it clear what's in it for them when you're introducing new technologies. And making people feel okay about moving off of one way of working and into another by providing some rewards, right? So, for example, an organization that I worked with started to track how many contacts were being created in the CRM on a weekly basis. And would do some prizing for folks who created the most contacts, or for folks who had customized a dashboard, right? And so just creating some reward mechanisms in there. It's adopting these new processes and ways of working inherently disruptive. And you have to be prepared for that. And some of that disruption could look like people leaving. It could look like people saying, I don't want to be working in this way. This is not why I got into this work, to work in a database. And so for some folks, it will create enough resistance that they'll want to leave. For leaders of organization, you might recognize that there's big skills deficits that you need to address through HR, and obviously one of the ideal way to do that is to train folks up and provide them enough time and space to do that training. But sometimes it means looking for new types of talent to fill those roles. So it's the human piece is everything. Quite frankly, it's people who are doing the work. Technology is not magic yet; it can't read our brains. So we constantly have to be inputting information into it and configuring it to output information that's relevant to us.
Well, you certainly touched on it in your last question, but I want to dive in a little deeper that digitization also requires a lot of really great leadership around this sort of change management experience for the employees to really help bring all the stakeholders on board. And it would be really helpful if you could have some tips for nonprofit leaders in this area.
Yeah, happy to. So when we're changing how an organization operates, we're actually engaged in a level of systems change, right? So I think it's useful to look at some examples from effective systems change. And there's an article that I recently read from HBR, Harvard Business Review, about some like the secrets to network change agents. And basically, what it suggests is that change management happens, or systems change happens, not as a result of authority flows, not as a result of new policies or leaders sort of championing that change, but rather it happens because of well-placed, highly trusted, what we call like network agents who compel transformation around them by the very fact of the relationships that they have with people. And those people, those change agents aren't necessarily folks with the most authority in the organization, but they're the people with the most, or the deepest relationships and the greatest trust. And so as a leader, if I was leading an organization through this kind of systems change and digital transformation, I would find those folks. Who are the folks that people listen to, who inspire people, who are motivators, and I would focus on bringing them on side with the project. I would create some roles for them as part of your digital transformation project. I would train them up first, and then you would kind of like deploy them back into their regular roles, but with this other sort of responsibility about bringing people along through the training or through the new process documentation, and as folks learn how to use those new systems. And I think that's one of the best things that a leader can do. Secondly, I think that leaders can't anymore sort of defer technology knowledge to a vendor or to a consultant. They don't need to be fingers on keyboard. They don't need to know like how to configure these things, but they do need to know, sort of what are the 5 to 10, emergent and popular technologies on the market today, and what is possible if we use them well, because then that leader will be well positioned to sort of intervene in program design and say, well, there's an approach that I saw with this platform and you can build it without much code. And, that seems like that would be a better way than just doing, emails back and forth between our program users, right? So they need to know enough about the trends and what's possible to be able to sort of insert that technology mindset across the organization, and also, to be able to recognize when their program staff who might have a vision of using technology, when they're coming to them with an idea that makes a ton of sense, and be able to green light that, as opposed to being like, oh, I don't know, like maybe that's technology's maybe not the right way to go with that, right? So they need to know enough to be able to lead folks through use and adoption.
I wonder if you could share a success story that you may have of working with an organization um, who's made progress in terms of digitization that you can share that sort of evolution or transformation that they went through.
Absolutely. There's a number of them, but one I'll share was an organization doing working on literacy in Canada, and so running some programs with clinics who were seeing patients anyway, young patients, and how to sort of promote reading and literacy as a kind of secondary effect of visiting the doctor, right? So they were working with all of these clinics and trying to onboard those clinics, trying to survey them as to what sorts of volumes of patients they were seeing, what kind of age ranges, then send them out books, and then understand which books had been distributed, and then also sort of survey on program effect. And they've been doing all of this without any kind of use of technology. So it was just emails back and forth, maybe the occasional, Google form linked to trainings were being scheduled one-on-one. And so you can imagine doing that with one clinic and being like, okay, that's not so bad. But try and do that with, 24 clinics. And, it was so much time was being sent just even on emailing back and forth to try and find a time for training. I mean, if 10 emails have to go back and forth just to like find one time to meet, that's hopelessly inefficient, and it makes me want to pull out my hair. So what we did is they were already using Salesforce for fundraising. And so we said, well, we can probably customize your CRM to handle these applications that are coming in, to create some process automations, to let folks book time that you're available to meet with. We created sort of synchronous and asynchronous training so that people could do the training either in person or access recordings, and basically just set up a whole bunch of triggers based on dates or based on the last action that the clinic had taken, to send them the next piece of the puzzle, right? The next thing that they needed to do. And so now, instead of scrambling to figure out which clinic is at which stage and who needs what when, they've got dashboards that say, okay, these 5 clinics are here, these 6 are here, these 7 are completing. And it's made their whole program delivery process, 10 times faster, I would say, maybe even more. But it's definitely a process. Like I still work with them once a week to do some training around using Salesforce, and some training about the integrations that we've built, so that eventually they're going to be able to manage all of that internally. And they're getting there. They really are getting there. But it did require that discipline, that new habit formation. But they're seeing the results of it. They're seeing the benefits.
Well, I touched on this earlier in my introduction, but of course, you've written an e-learning course that's available through Charity Village on this topic, and I would love it if you could give our audience a bit of a high-level view of what's covered in the course and how it can be helpful to them.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So one of the things that we start off with is some fundamentals of cloud computing. And so those are really like principles to keep in mind when you're thinking about how cloud-based operations can work. Those principles help you make better technology decision-making, because when you start to say, oh, does this decision meet that principle? No, it doesn't. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. I'll think about a different approach. The course also talks about the basics of starting to create a data model, which sounds highly technical, and but it's really not. It's just an exercise in documenting what information you collect from each person that you engage with. Right? We're familiar with this with donors and donation data, right? With a donor, we need certain information in order to produce a tax receipt. So that tax receipt helps us shape what the data model is with respect to that donor. But the same thing can be said for a program participant. If we have a grant report where we have to report certain things about that program participant, well, that informs the information that we want to collect on that program participant. So we walk through how you can begin to create a data model that then really serves as a bit of a roadmap for how you collect information from folks, and how you put it into a report or into a dashboard. So that's one of the key elements of the course. We talk about, one of the first essential steps that I think organizations can take today, which is, I say, pick a team. There are two major players in the world of cloud computing right now. You could say three, but we'll just focus on two right now. Google and Microsoft. So Google's Workspace and then Microsoft's 365. And so many organizations I encounter are living life in hybrid. So they might be officially a Google organization, but they're still creating all of their content in Microsoft Office tools, or vice versa. So many organizations I speak to use Microsoft 365. They have access to that whole suite of products, but they use Google Forms, just because they don't know that Microsoft has a Forms tool, right? So my first piece of advice is pick one side or the other, and because they're very complementary in terms of the product offerings and the tools that are included in those suites, and go deep on each one of them, right? Invest in just learning the essentials of what those suites can do, because as I mentioned, organizations are using 10 to 15% of the capacity of these really powerful suites of tools that for the most part are generously donated by those two companies. So start to dive deep into your, what I would call your core operating platform. And for the organizations who are not yet on the cloud, that's the first step, is speak with someone about migrating from your on-premise server or your webmail into either Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. As I mentioned, both products are available for free to charities. And there's a whole lot of self-paced learning about how to get up and running with them.
Well, thank you, Anya. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you, and for your practical but deep expertise and insights into the best practices for nonprofits to embrace digital solutions and technology and data to support their operations and enhance the impact of their mission. So, really appreciated your time today, and I want to thank you for this time to discuss this.
Happy to be here, Mary. Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this with you. Always happy to hear myself speak.
Okay, thank you.